If you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to Jeremiah chapter 12. Jeremiah chapter 12, and this is going to be where we spend our time together tonight. Jeremiah chapter 12, the weeping prophet, all right? I mean, that's the nickname that we've given him. It may be rightfully so. The presumed author of Lamentations and the book of Jeremiah is chock full of grief and remorse and sadness for the nation of Israel, for the people of God. And you see, as Jeremiah unfolds, as his life unfolds, his ministry, it is an incredibly sorrowful ministry, an incredibly sorrowful life. And from time to time, as all of us do, what Jeremiah would do is he would open up his heart to God. I mean, he would just lay it all out. He would pour out his heart to God. And oftentimes what that came across as, and what it would come across to us as, is complaining. And sometimes we complain, don't we? I mean, we grumble and we complain, and sometimes we even complain to God. This is what Jeremiah is doing here in this particular passage in Jeremiah chapter 12. He is complaining to God. And it may seem a little presumptuous superficially, right? To say, the audacity of a man to complain to the creator of the world. How could he? But God never rebukes Jeremiah for his complaining. Instead, from this passage at least, he almost exhorts him a little bit, gives him a little bit of encouragement and reminders. And that's what we're going to look at. We're going to first look at the complaint of Jeremiah, examine it a little bit, and then we're going to look at how God replies to Jeremiah, what God says to Jeremiah. Because oftentimes we find ourselves in a situation very similar to Jeremiah. We find ourselves in a situation or maybe a circumstance in life where we need someone to complain to. Our life is full of whatever anxiety or sorrow or pain, whatever it is, and we find ourselves needing to pour our hearts out to God. So an incredibly applicable passage, especially for us. Let's look at Jeremiah's complaint. And really, we're looking at two different things. It rests on two different premises. And the first one we see in verse 1 and verse 2. It's how the evil thrive. And I don't know if you've ever been in a situation like this, but it seems as if we all are in a situation like this, where the evil thrive. They perpetually thrive. Read verse 1 and verse 2 with me, or the first half of verse 2 at least. Righteous are you, O Lord, when I complain to you, yet I would plead my case before you. Why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why do all who are treacherous thrive? You plant them and they take root. They grow and produce fruit. This is kind of the way that we perceive life. We understand that God is in total control, that God has set everything in motion, so that God has complete authority over every aspect, right? That He is in total authority. So why does God allow bad people to be successful, right? I mean, wouldn't the world be a much better place if just good and righteous people, holy people, were in control? I mean, wouldn't the world be a much better place if we wiped out the White House, wiped out Congress, and we just put good, holy, righteous people in there? That's starting to sound pretty good, doesn't it? Why is it that the righteous aren't the ones a lot of times that are thriving? Why is it that those who are wicked continually to prosper? I was looking up some of the biggest companies in the world and the agendas that they had. Is just humbling. Because the world continually feeds these companies that are demoralizing the entirety of the world. The evil are thriving. The evil continually and perpetually always seem to have success. You don't believe me? It wasn't too long ago that there was a recession. And a lot of the major companies, a lot of the major corporations, a lot of the major industries in the United States began to decline. There is one industry that did not. Pornography industry. Why does evil thrive? Maybe you're finding yourself in a position like that with a boss who is self-centered, self-seeking, self-glorifying. Or maybe you're in a position like that at school where you're constantly surrounded by people and your peers who are always choosing to do the wrong thing, and yet they are continually, it seems, rewarded for it. Why do the evil thrive? That's the first premise that Jeremiah poses to God. And the second one is hypocrisy. And this is something that we always struggle with, isn't it? The hypocrisy in the world. Get back up to verse 2. You plant them and they take root. They grow and produce fruit. The second half of verse 2 is this. You are near in their mouth and far from their heart. But you, O Lord, know me, and you see me and test my heart towards you. Hypocrisy is everywhere. These evil hypocrites. And you're familiar with these people. They say one thing, that I'm a Christian, right? I'm a faithful servant of God. I go to church, and I sit in the pew. But Monday through Saturday, you would not be able to tell that they ever sat in a pew in their life. Incredibly hypocritical. They say that they believe in God, but their life doesn't reflect it. Sometimes, if we're going to be honest and a little harsh and critical of ourselves, sometimes don't we do that? Sometimes don't we act hypocritical? We say, God's going to carry me through. God's going to take care of me. It doesn't matter what life says. It doesn't matter what life gives to me. God is always going to take care of me. But then when life gives us a curveball, we worry about it. We're anxious about it. We spend all of our time and energy focused around that thing. Sometimes we say one thing and we act in a totally different way. That is the fundamental concept of hypocrisy. But Jeremiah's complaint here is that they talk about you. They pronounce a relationship with you, but their lives, they don't reflect it. Their hearts are far from you. Let's get into God's reply, because this is an incredibly applicable passage, an incredibly applicable complaint, because we see evil thriving all over us, and we see hypocrisy, even in Christianity, all around us. So what does God say? What does God have to say when we complain and we bring these things to his attention, that the evil are thriving, that there are hypocrites all over the world? God's reply, first in verse 5, this is what God says, verse 5 and verse 6, it can get worse. It can get worse. Look at this, if we can summarize these, verse 5 and verse 6. If you have raced with men on foot, and they have wearied you, how will you compete with horses? And if in a safe land you are trusting, what will you do in the thicket of the Jordan? For even your brothers in the house of your father, even they have dealt treacherously with you. They are in full cry after you. Do not believe them, though they speak friendly words to you. It can get a whole lot worse. You're running with men now. Let's get out of the kiddie race and start running with the big boys. It can get a whole lot worse than the situation that you're talking about. And obviously God knows all the evil that's ever gone on in the world. And he's telling Jeremiah, hey, it can get a lot worse. Maybe that's what you're thinking in your life. Yeah, I've got a bad situation. My work life isn't that great. My home life isn't that great. And I'm really struggling in my faith. I don't care what's going on in your life. It can get worse. Just finished reading a book by Amy Morin. In the introduction of this book, she tells about the reason why she's writing this book. She tells about the instance when she was 21 years old. She attended a basketball game in this particular auditorium with her mother, and they were laughing and having a good old time. And as she was, here she is, a 21-year-old, enjoying time with her mother. The next day, her mother passed away suddenly, unexpectedly. So at 21, she finds herself questioning, why me? How could this life allow something like this to happen to me? She's doing the woe is me. And as she continues to grieve and as she continues to move on through that phase of her life, she marries a man named Lincoln. And Lincoln and her, they're married for several years. And at this particular moment, it is 3 years since her mother passed away. So they were talking to one another, wondering what they could do to celebrate the life and the death of her mother and to remember. So they decided to go to one of those games again in the same auditorium that she last saw her mother. Well, they had a wonderful time with friends and family. When they got home that night, her husband started complaining of back pains, rushed into the ER. The doctor finally comes out, and she said, I didn't have to hear a word that came out of his mouth. I knew Lincoln had passed away. I lose my mother at 21, and 3 years later, I'm a widow. Things can get worse. And that story, it kind of puts in perspective the story of Job, doesn't it? Things can always get worse. Job may be thinking, I've lost my camels, I've lost my oxen, how could things possibly get worse? Then the next servant comes in, you've lost your sheep too. Then the next servant comes in, you've lost your donkeys. Then the next servant comes in. You've lost your children. How could things possibly get worse? Your wife tells you, curse God and die. How could things possibly get worse? You're covered in boils, head to toe, scratching yourself with a piece of pottery sitting in ashes. God says things can always get worse. So you may be thinking about the situation and looking around in the world and saying, God, how could things ever get any worse? They can. About 10 years ago, homosexual marriages were outlandish. Fast forward 10 years. Not only are they accepted, now you can't even speak against them. Things can get worse. So when you find yourself complaining and you're asking, God, why are you allowing this to happen? Why are you sitting idly by and watching this life unfold like this? Remember God's reply to Jeremiah, verse 5 and verse 6, things can always get worse. Verse 7 and verse 8, if we could summarize this, we might say that God says, I am hurting. Look at verse 7 and verse 8 and read it with me. I have forsaken my house. I have abandoned my heritage. I have given the beloved of my soul into the hands of her enemies. My heritage has become to me like a lion in the forest. She has lifted up her voice against me. Therefore, I hate her. God is hurting. He looks around at Israel and he sees the treacherous nature, all the evil that's going on in his nation, his chosen race. God's hurting. You think God enjoys it? You think God enjoys seeing the hypocrisy? You think God enjoys seeing those people who are playing the Christian but not practicing it? God hurts. God hurts when we sin. Look at this analogy. I have forsaken my house. I've given them up. I have abandoned my heritage. I have given the beloved of my soul into the hands of her enemies. Can you imagine giving your child over to the enemy? My heritage. My heritage has become to me like a lion in the forest. She has lifted her voice against me. Therefore, I hate her. Can you imagine raising this little puppy, right? And you love this little puppy and you take care of this puppy and you feed it and you make sure all of its needs are met. And then one day, it just turns on you. And now you got to put your puppy down. Do you think God is hurting? God is in such pain. When we sin and when we see the sinfulness of life around us, don't ever forget there is one man that is hurting more than you are. There's one being that is in such agony over sin because of the love for his people. If we could summarize verse 10 and verse 11, we might say that history repeats itself. I mean, there's nothing new under the sun. Read verse 10 and verse 11 with me. Many shepherds have destroyed my vineyard. They have trampled down my portion. They have made my pleasant portion a desolate wilderness. They have made it a desolation. Desolate, it mourns to me. The whole land is made desolate, but no man lays it to heart. I mean, we know this, right? History repeats itself over and over and over and over again. There's nothing new under the sun. And so it is with God. So it is with religion. There's nothing new under the sun. You remember? As the book of Judges opens up, it's almost summarized there at the very beginning. Judges chapter 2. Look at what it says in verse 18 and verse 19. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by her groaning because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. They did not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. History repeats itself over and over and over again. You see the pain of God being lived out over and over and over again. And God is in pain. It reminds me of Luke chapter 12, when Jesus sets his face to go towards Jerusalem, to enter it for the very last time in his earthly life. In my mind, I always see him sitting at the top of a hill, overlooking Jerusalem, and he says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jerusalem. The city that kills the prophets." Do you think God is hurting? History certainly repeats itself over and over. I think finally what we see is the anger of God described in verse 12 and verse 13. Upon all their bare heights in the desert, destroyers have come. For the sword of the Lord devours from one end of the land to the other. No flesh has peace. They have sown wheat and have reaped thorns. They have tired themselves out, but profit nothing. They shall be ashamed of their harvest because the fierce anger of the Lord. God is angry. We see that he's hurting, right? And we see that this is nothing new. When you complain to God, remember that God is hurting too, that there's nothing new, that he's been there, he's dealt with this. And remember, God's angry. God doesn't appreciate sin. God doesn't appreciate sinfulness. The anger of God was kindled against these people. This isn't the first time that God's anger has been kindled. You remember the story of Noah. You know Noah. The world was so wicked that God chose to destroy it. You think God had pleasure in destroying the entire world? Absolutely not. Or consider Sodom and Gomorrah. Do you think God took pleasure in destroying Sodom and Gomorrah? I don't think so. Or Mount Sinai. In Exodus chapter 32, let's flip over there real quick. You remember what he says. He tells Moses at this point, he tells him about the golden calf. He says, get out of here. You got business to take care of. And this is what he tells Moses in verse 9. And the Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now, therefore, look at how angry God is. Now, therefore, let me alone that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make you a great nation. Move over, Moses. Let me kill them. Let me kill every single one of them. That's the anger of God. After delivering them from Pharaoh, after crossing the Red Sea, after all the things in the wilderness, now they've made a golden calf. You think God was angry? Absolutely. Let's go back and rehash this. Jeremiah's complaint to God is that the evil thrive. The evil in the world, they are absolutely blooming. And they pretend as if they have to answer to no one, especially to God. And there are people in the world that claim to be righteous. They claim to be good. But they're not living it out. They're being hypocrites. That's the complaint. And God's reply, I am hurting. I am in pain. Don't worry about this because things can always get worse. This has happened before. History repeats itself. And don't worry. Sin makes me angry. There's the warning in there for us. Sin makes God angry. Maybe you've got sin in your life. Maybe you've got something that you need help with. You need God's deliverance from. Bring it to God and let Him save you. Or maybe you're in a situation where you're complaining to God and you need God's comfort and peace. God can give it to you if you ask Him.